He walked into my courtroom wearing his service like a shield, not as a symbol of duty, but as a weapon of immunity. Colonel Marcus Vance didn't enter. He invaded the space, carrying the kind of heavy, polished arrogance that only comes from a lifetime of being told yes. He was in full dress uniform, every ribbon, every badge, every button meticulously calculated to scream, "I am a man of consequence." He stood before the bench with his chin held at an angle that suggested the law was a suggestion for commoners, not a rule for men like him. He didn't know it yet, but that uniform, which he wore to intimidate, was about to become the very thing that laid him bare. Most people walk into a courtroom seeking either mercy or justice. Vance walked in seeking an exemption. He had been pulled over for a reckless act, something that put lives at risk, but to him, it was merely an administrative annoyance, a bump in his schedule that he expected to be ironed out by his rank and his resume. He looked at the courtroom, at the bailiff, at me, with the distinct disdain of a man who viewed the judicial process as an inconvenience, a delay in his busy itinerary of national security matters. The silence in the room wasn't respectful, it was heavy. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone knows what is coming, except for the person it is coming for. I've sat on this bench for long enough to recognize the smell of entitlement. It has a specific odor, acrid, stale, and completely devoid of self-awareness. He wasn't here to account for his actions. He was here to conduct a performance. He had his lawyers flanking him like a phalanx, expensive suits against a blue uniform, a tableau designed to say, "Look at the stature of this man. Do not dare question him." But the problem with using your status as a bludgeon is that eventually you hit something harder than your own pride. In my courtroom, facts don't care about your ribbon count, and the law doesn't salute your rank. He was about to learn that while he may have spent 22 years commanding people to obey, he had spent the last 20 minutes making a fatal error in judgment. He thought the law was beneath him. He was about to find out exactly how low beneath him really was. The air in the room shifted. He didn't notice. He was too busy adjusting his lapels, basking in the glow of his own vanity, completely unaware that he had just stepped into the one place where his title was nothing more than a piece of cloth. The case of the people against Colonel Vance was about to begin, and he was the only one in the room who didn't realize he had already lost. The night air was biting, the kind of January cold that makes every breath visible in the headlights of a cruiser. Officer Martinez was working a detail in a quiet, residential stretch where the posted speed limit was 25 miles per hour. It was the sort of place where that limit wasn't just a law, it was a pact between the driver and the families living behind the fences. Then came the white BMW. It tore through the peace like a jagged blade, clocking in at 75, 3 times the limit, a lethal projectile in a place where children slept. When she lit him up, he didn't stop, he accelerated. He treated the 2 stop signs he blew through like suggestions, a testament to the belief that his time was inherently more valuable than the lives of anyone else on the road. He finally pulled over, but the posture he assumed even inside the car wasn't that of a driver being stopped. It was the posture of a man who was being inconvenienced by a subordinate. When Officer Martinez approached the window, hand near her holster, not out of aggression, but out of the hard-won caution that keeps officers alive, she wasn't met with an apology. She was met with a glare. Colonel Vance, because that was the name he wore like armor, looked at her. He didn't offer a license. He offered a challenge. He wanted to know if she had any idea who he was, as if the badge on her chest was supposed to vanish the moment he named his rank. He proceeded to lecture her, not on traffic safety, not on the laws he had just shredded, but on his own importance. He spoke of military intelligence, of top-secret clearances, of national security implications that far outweighed the safety of the families on that street. He used his rank as a cudgel, trying to beat her into submission with words. When she didn't break, he went lower. He spotted the wedding ring on her finger. He asked about her husband. When she told him her husband was a veteran, a sergeant, the colonel didn't offer a brother-in-arms respect. He laughed. He told her that sergeants take orders from officers like him, and suggested she needed to learn a similar lesson in obedience. It was a cold, calculated strike. He wasn't just breaking the law, he was trying to break the person enforcing it, pressing on the most vulnerable nerve he could find, all because he was convinced he was untouchable. By the time the file reached my desk, it was a heavy stack of paper radar logs, dashcam footage, sworn statements. But the most damning evidence was the citation itself, torn into 2 jagged halves and sealed in an evidence bag. It was a physical manifestation of his disdain. It wasn't just a destroyed piece of paper, it was a silent, violent statement. The morning of the hearing, the air in the courtroom felt different. It was humid with the anticipation of an inevitable clash between two worlds, the world of absolute, unquestioned military hierarchy and the world of the cold, hard, unyielding law. At 9:15, the courtroom doors swung open. Colonel Vance didn't walk in. He made an arrival. He was in full dress uniform. He hadn't chosen a suit to blend in or humble himself. He was betting everything on the visual authority of his service. Rows of ribbons, polished brass, that caught the morning light like a warning, and badges that spoke of a career spent far above the common concerns of traffic law. He was flanked by two attorneys, men in sharp charcoal suits who moved with the polished, predatory grace of high-priced defense counsel. They weren't there to argue the law. They were there to argue his stature. I sat on the bench watching, waiting for the crack in the facade. He didn't offer a nod of recognition to the bench. He didn't acknowledge the clerk or the public gallery. He stood between his lawyers with his chin tilted upward, a posture of permanent elevation. It was the face of a man who looked at the room and saw only obstacles to his schedule, not a forum for truth. He held himself with an unnerving, almost practiced ease. It was the arrogance of a man who truly believed that he was the most important person in the building, perhaps the most important person in the city. In the back of the room, Officer Martinez sat alone. She was in her crisp uniform, face drawn with the specific, bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who spends her shifts protecting a neighborhood that has no idea how fragile its peace really is. She wasn't armored in ribbons or brass. She was armored in the quiet, steady reality of her work. She didn't have a legal team to polish her appearance. She had a report, a camera, and the truth. The contrast was stark. It was the colonel versus the cop, the theory of authority versus the reality of service. He was waiting for the judge to recognize his rank. She was waiting for the judge to recognize the facts. Neither of them knew yet that in my courtroom, only one of those things carries any currency. The hearing was about to expose exactly what happens when vanity meets the cold floor of justice. I called the case. The room went still, save for the rustle of papers and the low murmur of the colonel's legal team. They rose in unison, a display of choreography that spoke of hours of rehearsal. Mitchell stood between them, chin lifted, eyes scanning the courtroom not with respect, but with the cold, assessing gaze of a superior officer surveying a map. He looked at the gallery and then at me, and in that split second I saw his strategy. He intended to treat this courtroom not as a place of judgment, but as a stage for his own vindication. Officer Martinez took the stand. She was the antithesis of the man she had stopped. Where he was adorned with the shiny, heavy metal of his past accomplishments, she was dressed in the simple, utilitarian fabric of her current duty. She began to speak. Her voice was steady, a clear, chronological stream of facts. She didn't decorate her testimony with outrage. She didn't need to. She described the radar lock, the initial chase, the way the BMW tore through the neighborhood's peace, and the dangerous disregard for the stop signs. She spoke of the night like a seasoned professional, keeping the emotion locked behind the technical details. But then came the turning point in her account. She described the stop. She spoke of the look on his face, the way he looked at her, not as an officer of the law, but as a nuisance to be swatted away. And then she recounted the moment he looked at her wedding ring. She spoke of his questions about her husband, of his condescending laughter when she mentioned he was a sergeant. Even months later, recounting it under oath, the room seemed to shrink. I watched Mitchell. He didn't flinch. He didn't look ashamed. He looked bored. Then, the defense took the floor. They didn't start with the speed. They started with the setup. They attacked the radar calibration. They questioned the lighting conditions of the stop. They painted the officer's professional caution, the hand near the holster, as an act of unnecessary aggression. It was a classic playbook. Attack the integrity of the witness to obscure the crime of the defendant. Then, the second attorney pivoted to the character defense. He spoke at length about Mitchell's 22 years of service, the classified nature of his work, the unimaginable pressures of national security. He tried to frame the colonel's behavior not as a violation of traffic law, but as the byproduct of a mind weighed down by the secrets of the state. He wanted me to believe that a man who deals in high-level intelligence is somehow biologically incapable of stopping at a stop sign or treating a fellow public servant with basic human dignity. He actually had the audacity to suggest that Mitchell's remarks to the officer were merely a misunderstanding of military hierarchy. I sat there, listening to the polished lies, feeling the familiar, slow burn of indignation that only comes when someone tries to insult the intelligence of this court. The defense was trying to build a fortress out of excuses, but they had forgotten one thing. They were building it on a foundation of sand. When the defense concluded their opening, Mitchell didn't wait for an invitation. He stood with the eager, coiled energy of a man who believed his words would act as a reset button for reality. He adjusted his uniform, smoothed his lapels, and addressed the court. He didn't speak to me, he lectured me. He began to catalog his importance with the precision of a man filing a tax return. He was a military intelligence officer. He held top-secret clearance. He was engaged in matters of national security, things I, in my humble traffic court, couldn't possibly hope to comprehend. He spoke of an urgent meeting, a crisis of national importance that required him to ignore the speed limits, the stop signs, and the very safety of the citizens he had sworn to protect. To him, Officer Martinez wasn't an officer of the law. She was an administrative obstacle, a patrol officer who directed traffic and therefore, in his twisted hierarchy, lacked the intellectual capacity to grasp the nature of his responsibilities. He then turned his attention to the comments he made regarding her husband. He didn't apologize. He didn't even soften his tone. He simply stated that sergeants take orders from officers, and if she found his comments about her husband's service offensive, then she was clearly too sensitive for police work. It was a masterclass in deflection, a desperate attempt to frame his own cruelty as a simple organizational fact. Then, he looked me directly in the eye and delivered the blow that would seal his fate. He told me that my court was consuming his valuable time with trivial matters when he had real, consequential work requiring his attention. I allowed the silence to descend. In a courtroom, silence is a tool. A silence used well allows the gravity of a statement to fully penetrate the room, to sink into the floorboards, and settle in the lungs of everyone present. Mitchell had just offered a complete moral self-portrait, and it was a grotesque image. He had not merely claimed an exception for necessity. He truly believed that necessity was a category only he had the right to define. He believed that his schedule was worth more than the safety of a neighborhood, more than the life of a child on a bicycle. He wasn't just defending his actions, he was defending his right to be a menace. As he finished, looking around the room for the applause he assumed was coming, the silence remained total, heavy, and absolute. He had said everything he needed to say, and in doing so, he had stripped away any room for leniency. I looked at him. The silence in the courtroom wasn't just an absence of noise, it was an indictment. He had just laid out his own moral bankruptcy in plain English, under oath, believing that his rank was a cloak of invincibility. He had claimed that local traffic laws were beneath him, that his schedule was a national priority. He spoke of pressure as if it were a luxury item only he could afford. I leaned forward. It was time to disabuse him of that notion. I told him that his 22 years of service were a fact, his responsibilities were a fact, and I would never diminish the sacrifice of the military. But I told him, with deliberate, measured clarity, that his resume did not grant him a license to endanger children. It didn't authorize him to treat a fellow public servant with the casual cruelty he had displayed. I read his conduct back to him: 75 miles per hour, 2 stop signs, a dozen blocks of evasion. I broke it down, stripping away the ribbons and the national security excuses until only the raw, ugly truth remained. He had prioritized his own convenience over the safety of every living soul in that neighborhood. Then, I spoke about pressure. I asked him if he knew what real pressure was. I told him about Officer Martinez, working double shifts to pay for the care of a husband who had left a leg in Afghanistan and who still fought invisible enemies every time he closed his eyes. I told him that pressure wasn't having a security clearance. Pressure was keeping a marriage, a home, and a life intact when the country you fought for offered you nothing but a medal and a quiet exit. I asked him what he had done that was even remotely comparable to the weight that Sergeant Martinez carried on his back every single day. For the first time, the colonel's mask slipped. His eyes wavered. But before he could formulate a response, the courtroom doors at the back opened. It wasn't the bailiff. It was a woman, middle-aged, plain in her attire, but with a look of iron in her eyes. She carried a photograph like a shield. She didn't wait for the lawyers to object. She spoke with an urgency that pierced the cold, intellectual atmosphere of the room. Her name was Patricia Coleman, and she had come to tell us what that white BMW looked like from the sidewalk of Maple Street. The tension in the room, already high, suddenly snapped taut as she approached the bench. Patricia Coleman stood at the witness stand, holding the photograph as if it were a fragile piece of evidence that might shatter if she gripped it too tightly. She wasn't a lawyer, and she wasn't there to argue statutes or radar calibration. She was a witness to reality. She described that evening on Maple Street with the kind of precision that only comes from a trauma you've replayed in your mind 1,000 times. She told the court how she had been walking her dog when the white BMW tore through the neighborhood. She didn't see a lieutenant colonel. She saw a predator in a luxury sedan. She described the boy, Kevin, 14 years old, who had been riding his bicycle. She told us how he had swerved, how he had hit the pavement, how his hands and knees were shredded, and how, if he hadn't reacted in a split second, he would have been beneath those tires. She held up the photograph, a boy standing next to a bike that looked just a little too big for him, and placed it on the desk. Mitchell shifted. For the first time all day, his posture wasn't square. He looked at the photo, then away, then down at the table. The arrogance that had been his shield just minutes ago suddenly looked thin, almost transparent. He tried to object. His attorney tried to interject about prejudicial evidence, but I waved them down. I asked him, point blank, if he knew he had nearly ended a child's life that night. He looked at the photograph, then back at me, and his voice was lower, stripped of that commanding intelligence officer boom. He muttered that he hadn't seen anyone. He hadn't seen the bicycle. He hadn't seen the boy. I leaned back, letting his own admission hang in the air. That, I told him, is precisely the point. You didn't see him because you were traveling at 75 miles per hour through a residential zone. You didn't see him because you were moving as if the world were a video game where you were the only player. You were moving as if the neighborhood was nothing more than a blur to be conquered, a space that didn't deserve your caution. The courtroom was deathly quiet. Even his high-priced lawyers seemed to have run out of arguments. The national security defense had collided with the reality of a scraped knee and a terrified child, and it had been totaled. He had tried to hide behind the prestige of his uniform, but the uniform couldn't hide the fact that he had been seconds away from destroying a life. The weight of what he had done and what he had almost caused was finally, visibly, sitting on his shoulders. Patricia held the photograph up for the entire room to see. It showed a smiling boy on a bicycle, a snapshot of innocence that, 3 feet away, could have been a memory of a tragedy. The courtroom fell so silent you could hear the hum of the ventilation system. Mitchell looked at the photo, and for the first time, his shoulders slumped. The high and mighty lieutenant colonel was gone, replaced by a man who was forced to confront the reality of his own recklessness. I didn't give him a chance to pivot back to his national security narrative. I didn't care about his clearances. I cared about the 3 feet that stood between that boy and a tombstone. I delivered the verdict with the finality of a gavel drop. Guilty on all counts: reckless driving, excessive speed, evading police, running stop signs, and destruction of a citation. I didn't just fine him $2,000 was a drop in the bucket for a man of his ego. I sentenced him to 18 months of license suspension and 200 hours of community service at the Providence Children's Hospital. I wanted him to see, day after day, the cost of the choices he thought he had the right to make. He was to work in the hallways, in the proximity of children whose lives had been permanently altered by drivers who, like him, thought they were too important to follow the rules. And he would write formal, handwritten apologies to Officer Martinez, Sergeant James Martinez, Patricia Coleman, and Kevin. Failure to comply with a single detail would mean jail time, no negotiation. Then, I turned to Officer Martinez. I told her that she had performed her duty with a professional courage that the colonel couldn't dream of emulating. She didn't offer a dramatic performance. She simply cried quiet, relieved tears of a woman who had finally been seen. In the months that followed, the change in Mitchell was palpable. He stopped talking about his rank. He started talking about the children he worked with at the hospital. He admitted to me, during a compliance review, that he had spent his entire career confusing discipline with character. He had finally learned the hard way that discipline is what you do when people are watching, but character is what you do when you think no one is. James Martinez, the sergeant whose sacrifice the colonel had mocked, sat in the back of the room during those final hearings with his prosthetic leg and his cane, watching Mitchell with a flat, clear gaze. He didn't offer the colonel forgiveness, but he did say something I will carry with me. Thank you for not letting him use the uniform as a weapon. That is the job of the law. It isn't to bow to the powerful or to be intimidated by ribbons and brass. It is to be the great equalizer, the thing that ensures that on the road and in the courtroom, every life carries the same weight. No rank moves faster than a dead child. No clearance outweighs a neighborhood. And no resume, no matter how decorated, ever grants someone the right to treat the law as a minor inconvenience. Case closed.